Astăzi avem onoarea de a-l primi aici, pe TVR3 și la Verso Cărturești, pe unul dintre cei mai importanți și mai influenți autori ai contemporaneității, laureat cu premiul Man Booker, Richard Flanagan, care de curând a vizitat România. It is not that often that I get to interview a Man Booker recipient. I think my last one was Salman Rushdie, so it's a really important occasion for me. And I was going to ask you for the beginning of our interview, in which way did this distinction change you as an author?
I think it makes you easier with yourself, you know, because you don't have to worry about your destiny. You know, you sort of reach safe harbour. You know, to be a writer is to be a rather frightened creature, really, because you never know if your next book's going to be published, if you're going to have a readership. And after the Man Booker, you know, whatever befell me, whatever vicissitudes, I was sort of free now. I was free of all my own fears and terrors, and I could write what I wanted, and I felt a great freedom with it. I mean, that was the real gift of it, the freedom. And after that, I wanted to run more risks, not to be safe at all, but to do what the novel should, which is to experiment, to gamble, and to try and do something closer to the truth. And if I failed, it didn't matter.
It's like a green card, but in the meantime, it's a sudden and broader exposure, and I imagine it means also a lot of pressure. Were you comfortable with that as well?
You know, a very strange thing happened to me, because I won the Booker, and then a few weeks later my mother passed away, which is a normal thing for every human being. But what it meant was I didn't feel the pressure of the Booker Prize is an insignificant thing compared to losing a parent.
Yes.
And so it wasn't a strange way of blessing, because it put it all in proportion. And it was a strange thing, because the day after my mother passed away, I was meant to go on this big tour of America, and America had finally opened up for me. There was all this major television and so on that was to happen, and for writers these things are very rare, if ever they happen. And I didn't go, and I've never regretted not going, and because it was completely meaningless to me. And so I was fortunate to win the Booker, and that's just luck. At the end of the day, there's a group of readers who, for various reasons, decide your book is the one they'll award the prize to, but another 6 readers there or another 6 readers there, your book wouldn't even figure. And so you have to accept it just as, you know, good fortune. But in a strange way, my mother's passing was a much greater blessing, yes, because it gave me a sense of proportion about it. And so I didn't go to America. I didn't feel pressure. I wrote the book I was going to write, and I've continued on as I wish to be. It was liberating.
Născut în Tasmania, Richard Flanagan a cucerit una dintre cele mai importante distincții ale lumii literare internaționale, premiul Man Booker, în anul 2014, pentru romanul O cale îngustă spre nordul îndepărtat. Cartea spune povestea construirii căii ferate dintre Birmania de atunci, Myanmarul de astăzi și Thailanda, un episod al istoriei recente mai puțin cunoscut, cu mii și mii de victime. Tatălui Richard Flanagan, prizonier de război din partea Japoniei, a fost unul dintre cei care au contribuit la construirea acestei linii de tren. Your family line goes back to 19th century Europe, Ireland to be more specific. In that time, as an European, to make it to Australia meant exile or missionarism or being convicted. How far did you explore your family roots?
Well, Tasmania, where I'm from,
Yeah,
was formerly known as Van Diemen's Land.
exactly.
And it was the Gulag of the British Empire.
Yeah.
And my family were all Irish convicts sent out during the famine. Some were political prisoners, some just stole food to survive. It was a slave society. I mean, it was really like the Caribbean or Brazil, except the slaves were white slaves. The society I grew up in was profoundly shaped by an enormous silence about that experience. That there was the slave society came to an end in the mid-19th century, but then there was a century of silence and forgetting. And I guess it's true that man survives by his ability to forget, but equally freedom exists in the space of memory, and at a certain point it falls to certain people to walk back into the shadows and look at that darkness, if ever they're to return to the light and dance in it. And I guess coming from there and being a writer, that was a duty I wasn't able to escape, and it was something I felt I had to do. There's also Tasmania had an indigenous population. The Tasmanian Aborigines had been there for at least 40,000 years, and as well as being a slave society, there was an attempt at a genocide of these people, of few of whom survived. So those two things have shaped me enormously and are very important in my writing, and I guess it couldn't be otherwise.
Do you feel you have reversed this silence you were talking about and giving it a proper voice?
Well, that's not for me to say, Marius, that's for the readers to say. It wasn't conscious, it's something I've become more aware of as the books have been produced. I mean, in the end, you tell stories, you hope they're entertaining. Only later do you realise that they dealt with things that were buried deeply in you, that you were trying to squeeze this blood of slavery out of yourself and the people around you, drop by drop. But it takes a long time to understand your own subject, and it's taken me till now, possibly. To be honest, I try and write the best stories I can. I try not to think too much about the deeper themes or things animating them. I think you doom yourself as a writer when you do that. Reading is an act of communion where the reader grants the book the authority of their lives and their history and their soul. And at that point, these stumbling words and sentences, these poor conceits and characters, can come to life if the reader finds in it reflected something of themselves. And so more and more as I've written, I trust more and more to the mystery of story, and I run with that. And there's that old canard that you should only write what you know. It's a nonsense. You should write everything you don't know, and you should trust to the strangeness of where story takes you. And then when you allow that, when you don't tell the reader that something's dramatic or comic or erotic, the reader decides. Yes. And at that point, the novel comes alive. You know, if someone was to be, if a child was to be hit by a car out there, we wouldn't think it was tragic in the moment of it happening. We might hear a brake, a horn, we might hear a funny little stifled scream. We would go out, we might see a little bit of blood, we might see someone looking shocked. And the job of the writer is to describe life like that. And only later, when we were thinking about that, will we realise that it was tragic, that a child had been hit, that this was a terrible thing. but we would slowly come to that judgment. A book should do the same thing. A writer should strive for the same effect, to simply describe what is and leave it to God and the reader to judge whether it is a good thing or a bad thing, a sad thing or a comic thing or whatever. And always allow the reader the final judgment.
Talking about the things you know and the things you don't know, in your Booker Award-winning novel, The Narrow Road to the Deep North, you tell a story with a poignant significance for you, that of the railroad between Thailand and today Myanmar, a historical moment that you have witnessed secondhand through the stories of your father, who's been actually there, involved in it. Which are the stories you grew up with?
Well, my father was a prisoner of war of the Japanese. They built this 400-kilometre long railway through the jungle, and it was one of the great war crimes, but it's little known. Somewhere between 100,000 and 250,000 people died on it. And that's more people than there are words in my book about it. I grew up with some stories my father told, which tended to be comic stories. He didn't tell tragic stories. He didn't tell stories of horror. It was more the silences, the absences, the way he was moved by the pathos and comedy of life. It was in all those things that I guess I came to understand that I was a child of this death railway. And I realised at some point I had to write a novel about it, and I didn't want to write a novel about it, but I felt that if I didn't write this novel, I'd never write another book. So it was a strange burden. It was something I didn't wish to do, but felt compelled to do. And then I had another strange feeling, which was that if I didn't finish the novel before my father died, I would never finish it. And at that point I'd be destroyed as a writer. And so I spent 12 years trying to write it, and in the end my father was growing very old and sick, and so I had to redouble my efforts. I had to invent something that was completely unlike his experience, because if it was just fictionalised memoir it would fail. And I finished it, and I went in to see my father, who was now living in an old age home. He was 98. And he asked me how it was going, and I said I'd finished it. That was in the morning, and that afternoon he passed away. And that's really the story of that book.
În România, cărțile lui Richard Flanagan sunt traduse și aduse de editura Litera, cea căreia îi mulțumim pentru întâlnirea cu un autor absolut fascinant. Well, the story as fiction, and I'm quoting you now, offers the possibility of transcendence and liberation. Have you felt liberated once you told the story?
Well, it's strange. I mean, writing the book, I was interested in all those great questions about war, guilt, love, and I thought writing it I'd arrive at some answers, and when I finished writing the book I realised I knew absolutely nothing about any of them, and I had no answers at all. But I hope the book frames some of the questions correctly. That's as much as I could hope. And again, that's for the reader to decide whether I succeeded or not.
I went through some interviews, previous interviews of yours, and you always underline this strength of fiction. If life and human beings, mortals, cannot resolve things, cannot dismantle conflicts, cannot clear confusions, does fiction can?
I think fiction has the power to remind us of our essential humanity in a time when poisonous ideologies are once more on the march again, and they remind us that importance of kindness, of individual dignity, that there is no other, that everyone is always your brother and your sister, and you should never see another human being as less. I think also in an age where we're encouraged more and more to think of ourselves as alone and unconnected to other people, novels remind us we're not alone, that we always share things with others. And I think in that sense a novel remains a very powerful force for a better world rather than a worse world.
That leads me to my next question, because you often write about and create and recreate universes that are darker and gloomier than the one you live in today. And I was curious, do you ever feel this urge to elope into a lighter and brighter world through your fiction?
Well, I think, you know, I think my books are funny too.
Of course.
Yeah, and I think the world's neither tragic nor comic, but it is tragicomic. You know, the world is at once very sad and very funny. Both things are true. I think also that the world has many. The world is an endlessly beautiful place, and I sort of hope that in a way my novels are a way of acknowledging that endless beauty that's all around us, because there is such beauty, and yet we never stop to acknowledge it. There's beauty in the people around us,
Yeah.
in our family, in our friends, in the light in the sky. It's everywhere. So I hope my books reflect the largeness of the world.
Many writers confess that they knew they would follow a literary path once they had like an epiphany encountering the works of another writer from a previous generation, maybe even a classic. That is the moment when they decided they would also take on this path. But with you, I'm going to reverse the question. Encountering someone else's oeuvre made you ever think of stopping writing?
I feel a bit like Keith Richards. They said to him, the Rolling Stones,
Yes.
the greatest band in the world, he said, I've seen some great bands, we're not one of them, but we give it our best shot, you know. I mean, what I like, when I read writers who I really admire, it excites me to wish to write. You know, I never go back and look at my old books. I think...
Why don't you?
Because I guess every book is a cracked diary of your soul for the years you write it, and a deeply disappointing one at that. You know, it doesn't interest me. But the works of other writers make me feel that I'm part of some larger endeavour that has some worth. So no, I've never felt that. No.
The world we live in seems to be a continuous struggle to find or to impose someone else's truth over someone else's. Literature should be about the struggle or about the truth itself?
Well, literature should be about life. It's a failure like life, it's a comedy like life, and a joy like life.
How do you write? Do you have a certain routine?
I just sit at the table and make things up. I did a gig in America years ago, and there were about 2,000 earnest Americans, and I was next to a famous and must be nameless American writer, and they said, "How do you write?" You know, and she talked about how she researched the books, how she did all this work. She'd go and interview people, she'd set up databases, she'd have people out there collating information, and because Americans like the idea that writing's based in industry. And then she went on for about 15 minutes and everyone applauded and were very excited, and then they turned to me and they said, "How do you write?" And I thought a joke might be good, and I said, "Well, I'm Australian, we're a bit lazy." I said, "I get up in the morning and make it up." and no one laughed. And I felt like I was going to be swallowed up by the San Andreas fault. But you know, I sit at a table and I make it up each morning. And you know, when I was young, I had some bad jobs that I didn't much like, and I sort of astonished that I've reached this age and I'm still allowed to sit there and make it up each morning. And to me, it's like dreaming, and it's a huge joy to sit there. I stay there most of the day, you know, and I read, I write, I dream, and they all are one.
And what if it doesn't, simply that morning, it doesn't come up?
Well, most mornings it doesn't come up, but I've learnt that if you continue, things start to appear, and slowly the book grows feathers, and you feel air under the feathers, and then finally you're lifting on some strange thermal and you're rising into the sky. And sometimes that takes 2 or 3 years, but for about 6 months you're gloriously just circling and circling in that great rising vortex of air, and it's worth it for all those dead years to know those moments. And so now when it's not coming, I don't fear and I don't worry too much, because I know that toil will lead to that glorious moment of being aloft. And so I just hold on and wait for the air to rise beneath me.
You know, probably for most of us, the scary thing is that blank page in front of you waiting for the first letter or the first word. But again, with you, I'm going to reverse the question I was going to ask and simply ask you, when do you know a book is really finished?
I don't think they are. I mean, I don't know how you find it, Marius, but I think there's a certain point when you just abandon them. And because for some reason you can give no more to it. The books are sort of at their best grand failures, or all the books I like. They're not perfect creations. It may be you can have a perfect poem, but you can't have a perfect novel.
Maybe this is the reason you don't go back to your novels, because you just abandon them. Maybe they need more.
Maybe it's just a car wrecker's yard of sort of abandoned automobiles. I don't know.
You write about war, you write about love, you also write about, and you mostly write about human frailties, I would say. Do they all have the same source, the same originary spring?
What I like about frailty is it's the essence of being human. Without frailty, we're gods, and who would wish to be a god? You know, it's in frailty.
I could think of some characters from today's world wishing to be gods.
Well, they are. They're our leaders.
Yeah.
Sadly, but it's everything that's wonderful in this world celebrates the frailty, celebrates our failures. It's in defeat we discover who and what we are. No one knows who they are until they're tested, that is, until they fail. Only then do they discover their capacity for strength, for love, for kindness, for goodness. You know, the gods are never tested. It's impossible to test a god.
Yeah. You have 3 daughters, right? Which is the lens that you have taught them to see the world through?
Love. Love and only love, and honour love. That's all there is, really.
I cannot think of a better ending for our interview. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marius.